Imagine a tank that was designed in a hurry, shipped across an entire ocean, and forced to fight the most terrifying steel monsters of the Third Reich. History calls it the Ronson or a death trap, but the men who actually fought in it called it their home. This is the M4 Sherman. It wasn't the biggest, and it wasn't the most powerful, but it was the smartest and most reliable machine ever built. Today, we're tearing down the Hollywood myths to show you why the Sherman was the true liberator of Europe and how American industrial muscle outsmarted the German cats. The origin of the M4 Sherman was born from a state of absolute emergency. In 1940, the United States Army was a ghost of a force, equipped with outdated tanks that wouldn't have lasted a minute on a modern battlefield. As the German Panzers crushed France, American engineers were given an impossible task: create a medium tank that could be mass-produced in the thousands, fit on a standard transport ship, and be reliable enough to drive from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Berlin without breaking down. The result was the M4 Sherman, a masterpiece of standardized engineering that prioritized ergonomics, reliability, and the ability to evolve as the war grew more lethal. Unlike the handcrafted German tanks, the Sherman was built on the world's most advanced assembly lines. Companies like Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors turned their massive factories toward war, producing nearly 50,000 Shermans in just a few years. This was the arsenal of democracy in action. Every part of a Sherman was interchangeable. If a tank in the field needed a new engine or a transmission, a spare could be flown in and installed in hours. This logistical superiority was the invisible weapon that the Germans could never match. For every Tiger the Germans carefully machined by hand, the Americans could flood the battlefield with 100 Shermans that just refused to quit. The design of the Sherman was revolutionary for its time, especially in its focus on the human beings inside. While Soviet and German tanks were cramped, dark, and exhausting to operate, the Sherman was a marvel of ergonomics. It featured large hatches for quick escape, a turret basket that kept the crew together, and even a radio in every single tank, something the enemy could only dream of. The Sherman also introduced the world's first gyrostabilizer for its main gun, allowing American gunners to fire accurately while moving across rugged terrain. It wasn't just a machine, it was a professional workplace designed to keep its crew alive, alert, and ready to fight. Protection on the Sherman is often criticized, but the reality is far more complex. The front hull was sloped at an aggressive angle, providing effective protection against the most common German anti-tank guns of the early war. But the Sherman's true secret weapon was its wet stowage system. American engineers realized that most tanks burned because their ammunition was hit and ignited. By surrounding the ammo racks with water and glycerin, they reduced the risk of fire by over 80%. The Sherman might get knocked out, but the crew would walk away alive. This philosophy of survivability made the Sherman the most trusted home an American soldier could ask for. Powering the Sherman was a dizzying array of engines, from the massive Wright Continental Radial to the legendary Chrysler Multibank. Because the US needed to produce so many tanks, they used whatever powerful engines were available. The most famous was the General Motors diesel in the M4A2, which became the favorite of the Soviet Union and the Marines. These engines were incredibly reliable, capable of running for thousands of miles with minimal maintenance. While German crews spent their days fixing broken transmissions, Sherman crews were often seen enjoying hot meals or sleeping, knowing their tank would start the moment they turned the key. When the Sherman officially entered service in 1942, it was a world beater. During its debut at El Alamein, it absolutely dominated the German Panzer IIIs and IVs, proving that American engineering had arrived on the world stage. It was a 30-ton brawler that could do everything: support infantry, hunt tanks, and lead high-speed breakthroughs. The Sherman was the universal tank, a machine that could be fitted with everything from flamethrowers to rocket launchers and swimming kits. It was the iron foundation of the Allied victory, a machine that proved that in total war, the smartest design is the one that actually makes it to the battlefield in one piece. The Sherman's combat record is a story of adaptation and grit. In the scorching deserts of North Africa and the rugged mountains of Italy, the Sherman proved its worth as a rugged mountain climber. Because it was narrower than the German heavy tanks, it could navigate narrow passes and old Roman bridges that the Tigers couldn't even approach. American and British tankers used the Sherman's speed to outflank the enemy, relying on the tank's quick turret traverse and stabilized gun to get the first shot in a world where first to fire usually meant first to win. The Sherman was the cavalry of the modern age, a machine built for the chase. However, the invasion of Normandy in 1944 brought the Sherman face to face with its greatest nightmare, the Panther and the Tiger. It was here that the myth of the death trap was born. The standard 75mm gun of the Sherman struggled to penetrate the front of the German heavyweights, forcing American crews to develop swarm tactics. They used smoke shells to blind the German monsters and then used their superior speed to get around to the thin side armor. It was a brutal, high-stakes game of cat and mouse, but the Sherman's reliability meant that for every Panther the Germans had in the field, the Allies had 10 Shermans ready to strike from every direction. To solve the firepower gap, the Americans and British created the 76mm and the legendary Firefly. By mounting a high-velocity anti-tank gun onto the Sherman chassis, they turned the underdog into a tiger hunter. The Firefly, in particular, was the only Allied tank in Normandy that could kill a Tiger from the front at long range. The Germans feared these upgunned Shermans so much that they ordered their crews to target the long-barreled Shermans first. This led to a desperate arms race in the fields of France, where the Sherman proved that its modular design was its greatest strength. It could be upgraded and up-armored right in the field to meet any new threat. Life for a Sherman crew was a constant battle against fatigue and the unknown. They lived, ate, and slept in their 30-ton home for weeks at a time. Because the Sherman was so reliable, it was often used to lead deep breakthroughs into the German rear, sometimes driving for 20 hours a day. The crews appreciated the small comforts of the American design, the heaters for winter, the relatively soft ride, and the abundance of spare parts. They knew that if their track snapped or their engine coughed, a recovery vehicle was only minutes away. This sense of support gave the Allied tankers a psychological edge that the isolated and overstretched German crews never had. One of the most underrated features of the Sherman was its incredible soft ground performance in the later models, like the EZ-8. By introducing wider tracks and a new horizontal volute spring suspension, the Sherman became a master of the mud. While the heavy German tanks would sink and get stuck in the autumn rains of 1944, the EZ-8 could glide across the surface, maintaining the momentum of the Allied advance. This mobility allowed the Americans to bypass German strongpoints and keep the enemy off balance, proving once again that in war, the ability to move is often more lethal than the ability to shoot. By the end of 1944, the Sherman had shattered the German army in the west. It had survived the hedgerows of Normandy, the frozen hell of the Bulge, and the crossing of the Rhine. It was the machine that liberated Paris, Rome, and eventually, the concentration camps. The Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was a symbol of an industrial civilization that refused to be defeated. It proved that a medium tank, when supported by the world's best logistics and a professional crew, could defeat any superweapon the enemy could imagine. The Liberator had done its job, and the world would never be the same again. While the Sherman was battling Panzers in Europe, it faced a completely different kind of nightmare in the Pacific theater. Fighting across the islands of Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Guadalcanal, the U.S. Marines and Army used the Sherman as a blunt instrument to break the Japanese suicide defense. The Japanese lacked heavy tanks that could rival the M4, so they turned to desperate measures, using human bomb squads and hidden anti-tank pits. In the dense, humid jungles, the Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was a mobile bunker that provided the only protection for the infantry against a fanatical enemy that refused to surrender. To counter the Japanese bunker systems, the Americans developed the most terrifying version of the M4, the Zippo Sherman. These tanks were equipped with heavy flamethrowers that could spray a stream of napalm into caves and reinforced concrete fortifications from hundreds of feet away. It was a brutal form of warfare, but it was the only way to clear positions that had survived days of naval bombardment. The sight of a Zippo Sherman moving forward was often enough to break the resolve of the defenders. It was a machine of fire and steel that proved the Sherman's chassis was versatile enough to handle the most extreme roles imaginable. Japanese soldiers, terrified of the Sherman's invincibility, often resorted to climbing onto the tanks to plant magnetic mines or grenades. To stop this, Marine crews developed jungle modifications that made the Sherman look like a post-apocalyptic monster. They covered their tanks in wooden planks, welded thousands of nails to the hatches, and even used bags of concrete as additional armor. These field-expedient defenses were a testament to the ingenuity of the American soldier. They knew the Sherman was their only ticket home, and they were willing to do anything to keep the vultures from scratching through its steel skin. One of the most significant challenges in the Pacific was the terrain itself. The Sherman had to drive through volcanic ash, deep mud, and coral reefs that would have shredded the tracks of any other machine. Because of its reliable engine and robust suspension, the M4 could be landed directly from the sea, driving off LSTs and into the surf. This amphibious capability made it the perfect tool for island-hopping warfare. The Sherman was the iron fist of the Navy and the Marines, a machine that proved it could thrive in the salt and the humidity just as well as it did in the dust of the desert. Cooperation between the infantry and the Sherman crews reached a peak in the Pacific. Because visibility was so poor in the jungle, infantrymen would walk directly behind the tanks, using a telephone mounted on the back of the hull to talk to the commander inside. This tank infantry team became a lethal organism that could spot and destroy hidden Japanese snipers and machine gun nests with surgical precision. The Sherman was the shield, and the infantry was the eyes. It was a symphony of modern combat that minimized American casualties while systematically dismantling the most entrenched defenses in history. By the time the war in the Pacific ended, the Sherman had proven it was truly a global warrior. It had fought in every climate and against every type of enemy. While the world focused on the massive tank battles of Europe, the Shermans in the Pacific had been doing the quiet, dirty work of clearing the way for victory, one cave at a time. It was a machine that had earned the respect of the Marines, who valued its reliability above all else. In the Pacific, the Sherman wasn't a death trap, it was a lifesaver, the most important vehicle in the arsenal of the United States. When the guns of World War II went silent in 1945, most people expected the Sherman to be retired as a relic of the past. But history had other plans. In 1950, when the Korean War erupted, the Sherman was called back to the front lines. Now upgraded to the M4A3E8 EZ8 version, it found itself facing the Soviet-made T-34-85. This was the rematch the world had been waiting for. Despite being an older design, the Sherman dominated. Its superior optics, faster rate of fire, and much higher crew training allowed it to outduel the Soviet machines in the rugged mountains of Korea, proving that the Liberator still had teeth. The most incredible chapter of the Sherman's post-war life took place in the Middle East with the Israeli Defense Forces. Israel, a young nation fighting for survival, took thousands of scrapped Shermans and performed a miracle of engineering. They created the Super Sherman or M51, mounting a massive French 105mm gun into the old World War II turret. It was a grotesque but brilliant modification. In the 1967 and 1973 wars, these Frankenstein Shermans went head-to-head with modern Soviet T-54 and T-55 tanks. Incredibly, the old World War II hulls, driven by skilled crews, destroyed the modern Soviet armor, proving that a solid design can live forever if you give it the right tools. The influence of the Sherman on modern tank design is subtle but permanent. It established the American way of armored warfare, a focus on crew ergonomics, superior optics, and a massive logistical support system. The idea that a tank should be easy to repair and maintain became the gold standard for every Western tank that followed, including the M60 and eventually the M1 Abrams. The Sherman taught the world that a tank is not just a gun on tracks, it is a node in a massive industrial and military network. Without the lessons learned from the M4, the modern armored forces of the United States would not exist in their current form. Today, the Sherman is a beloved icon in museums and private collections around the world. Standing next to one, you can feel the incredible sense of purpose in its design. It doesn't look like a terrifying monster like the Tiger. It looks like a rugged, dependable tool, built by people who believed in the power of mass production and engineering logic. It is covered in bolts, hatches, and storage boxes, a true mechanical soldier. For many, the Sherman is the face of World War II, a machine that represents the victory of democracy over tyranny through pure industrial might and human courage. Interestingly, the Sherman's reputation has undergone a massive rehabilitation in recent years. Historians have moved past the death trap myths to look at the cold, hard statistics. They discovered that Sherman crews had one of the highest survival rates of any armored units in the war. The wet stowage and the easy escape hatches worked exactly as intended. The Sherman wasn't a tank that was meant to be invincible, it was a tank that was meant to win the war, and it did so by being good enough for everything while being the most reliable machine ever built. It was the unsung hero that did the work while others took the glory. In the final analysis, the M4 Sherman was the most important tank of the 20th century. It liberated continents, smashed empires, and continued to fight for decades after its creators had passed away. It was a machine born of desperation, built by the thousands, and driven by ordinary men who did extraordinary things. It was the iron workhorse of the free world, a machine that proved that in the theater of war, the smartest design is the one that brings you home. The Sherman has finally retired from the battlefield, but its shadow still looms large over history, a silent, iron testament to the power of a good idea and a nation that refused to be defeated.